Recording started.
Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you are listening to the VMware Community's Roundtable Podcast. This is podcast number 541. My name is Eric Nelson, and with me today I have my regular co-host, Matt Lungeth. Today is Wednesday, February 3rd, 2021. Matt, how are you doing today?
Eric, I'm well. Lots of shakeups and news events that we've seen. Change up in executive shuffles at Amazon and Rubrik. We have vExpert announcements coming here within the next week or so. Some other news coming in on VMworld itself. And maybe most importantly, I somehow managed to launder my AirPods. But how are you, sir? How are things out there? And what's the color of the bay?
Well, let me tell you, it has gone from winter and storm to beautiful sunny weather today. So the color of the bay is just a light green, smooth and glassy, because it just got to be a beautiful, beautiful day in Northern California. We went from winter to nice. So yeah, but a lot going on. The year has started. VMware's calendar year starts February 1st. So it is now officially 2021. New budgets kick off. Lots of exciting things going to be happening. And we'll mention a little bit about the event coming up, FutureNet, so we could talk about that. But Matt, you mentioned a couple things here as we got started, vExperts and a little bit VMworld. Why don't you take us through the news?
So vExpert, we're expecting those announcements to go out on the 11th. So that will be next Thursday, February the 11th. Again, if you're just catching up to all things vExpert, if you were a vExpert for 2020 and reapplied, because of the pandemic situation, you will automatically be carried forward for 2021. Net new applicants were reviewed just as normal through the diligent process that we go through. So expect those notifications for those announcements to go out on Thursday, the 11th. And then also some VMworld news. We had spoke about that on our last couple of episodes, that the event itself will be virtual for 2021, and we had seen a blog post coming out from that team that the event itself will be taking place October 5th through 7th this year, 5th through 7th, again in a virtualized format. So we have that to look forward to, and I'm sure that there'll be a ton of innovation from that platform, and excited to see where that's going to take us.
Nice. Yeah, all right. So October 5th through 7th. I'm trying to remember how that compared to last year. If I remember right, it was kind of about that same time period. Maybe a little bit later in October, but sounds good. So we'll be ramping up everything that's going on with community, virtual booths, all the rest of the stuff that's happening. So that should be exciting. And it's good that they set that date. I'm glad that they were able to, VMware was able to get a date set, and we can march forward with that, even though we're not through with all the pandemic stuff. And of course, thanks to all the vExperts who are out, did all the voting and all that. So we're excited for the vExpert Pro to have that all wrapped up, and announcing vExperts for 2021. And hopefully we'll all be able to get out and do a little bit more kind of guiding the community this year versus last. So excited. On the show today, getting to the show, we're going to be talking about edge cluster design for vSphere with Tanzu, networking. We have the FutureNet conference coming up. We're going to let people know how to go register for that. And on the show today, we have Raymond de Jong. He is a VCDX 284, a staff solution architect for VMware. And he also has a blog article out on this topic. So we thought we would take you through his blog and let him tell us about the topic. I know it's, as we've got vSphere 7 Kubernetes, the network fabric is just as important as Kubernetes itself these days. And so having Ray, as we know him, take us through his blog and a little bit of the architecture, thought that would be a great show for today. So Ray, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, how long you've been at VMware, and what does your career arc look like?
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Raymond de Jong. I'm from the Netherlands. I've been about 5.5 years in VMware right now. I started in professional services. First started with vSphere, vSun technology, then we needed more NSX-V consultant, so I started working with NSX-V, and then NSX-T came around, and I was lucky to be one of the first working on that product as well in PSO. And then I saw opportunities to move to what was back then the NSBU the NSBU solution architects, which were on the spearhead of NSX-T technology and features. I did a lot of testing, worked with a lot of customers on NSX-T with the latest features. And right now I'm in the customer success team, and we are working with VCF, integration with NSX-T, and obviously integration with technologies like multi-cloud, VMC on iOS, but also Tanzu.
Nice. Well, we got a shout out. So shout out to you on your blog. I do Cloud Extreme with an XTREME.info. Great blog. How long have you been blogging?
Thanks. Yeah, for several years. When I started at VMware, I'm not a regular blogger, I would say. I'm not blogging every week. It's about when something new is around and I discover or test it and I find it useful to put it up, I blog. But I try to blog about stuff which is not blogged before about, right? So I'm not a regular blogger, but try to contribute that way, yeah.
And Ray, did this particular article come from just a test case, something that you were practicing out as a POC, or was there actually some customer design behind this?
So when I was in the NSBU NSBU solution architect team, we had a lot of interaction with BU, and we really saw a lot of use cases from real customer environments. And this is just one example, is that we work with the BU about possible supported topologies for vSphere with Tanzu and NSX-T, right? So it's fairly new technology. Big companies running Tanzu worry about network, obviously, because they most likely want some kind of security boundary or have some requirements in terms of performance and scale and where to connect to, right? You don't want to have your test cloud native apps to be able to connect everywhere. And then NSX-T becomes a big deal, right? Tanzu is awesome, but NSX-T is important for you to integrate with with the company's network. So this is just yet another, I would say, testing and talking with the BU what's possible, and then putting it into some diagrams and some options, if you like, some design options. And this is hopefully something we can share in the future as well in design guides or similar material.
So I see 5 options here, and of those 5 options, do you want to work us through perhaps the most common of those, or what you've seen that might be possibly adopted the most, and why that's the case?
Yeah, do you want me to share my screen and go through the blog and then go through the options?
Sure, that would be fine.
Okay, cool. Let me also have a
So if you're listening to this podcast, you want to see what he's sharing with us, you can go to youtube.com/vbarbecue, BARBUCUE, something, I don't know.
And again, if you're listening along, I'd like to read the article at Future Point. It's available at cloudextreme.info, and extreme is XTREME.
So can you see my screen?
Sure. Why don't you go? There it is. Okay.
There we go.
So let me find the article. So the latest news is actually that there will be an update on the article, because they recently, with the recent release, they changed it a bit, but it's still valid for let's say not the latest and greatest vSphere, but I will explain what has changed. So the latest vSphere version with NSX-T integration make sure that each and every namespace gets a dedicated tier 1. So in this picture, it's a shared tier 1, but with the latest release, it will be a dedicated tier 1. Perhaps it's better if I share this deck instead, because that's the new topology. So every customer starting with vSphere with Tanzu on NSX-T is most likely to start with this topology. So this is, right now, the most common topology we see is for customers starting with Tanzu, doing a proof of concept, or just deploy their first supervisor cluster. And therefore you need obviously NSX-T installed, your edge nodes installed, an edge cluster configured, and the tier 0 configured on that edge cluster, which connects to your physical network.
Is
Once
there a
you've-
minimum version of NSX-T that supports Tanzu at this point?
I worked with it from 3.0. I don't know on top of my head what's the earliest version. I think it's 3.0, but you might want to check the compatibility guide there.
Sure.
So obviously your host where you run your workloads on needs to be prepared. And then you're ready to deploy your first supervisor cluster. And when you configure a supervisor cluster, you basically point it to an edge cluster. And once you've done that, it automatically finds the tier 0 it needs to connect to, and then do the auto configuration there. So each given namespace you deploy in a supervisor cluster will get a dedicated tier 1, which is giving you network separation. And obviously each tier 1 also hosts egress and ingress for your cloud native apps. That means that we have a load balancer instance, and we do network address translation north-south, and possibly and obviously firewalling to inside your namespaces and internally external traffic from and to your namespace. So what's important to know in terms of scale is that given in a supervisor cluster, we can create with a single edge cluster up to 200 namespaces. Obviously, in a namespace, you can deploy guest clusters to have namespaces in there. But if you want vSphere namespaces, you can have 200 namespaces per edge cluster. And the reason being is that you have edge nodes, which supports up to 40 small load balancer instances with 10 edge nodes in an edge cluster. You have 400 slots, but you do obviously active standby, which makes 200 load balancing instances. So keep that in mind. So if you are expanding your supervisor clusters and you want to add another supervisor cluster, you could create a supervisor cluster and use the same shared edge cluster if you like. And this really depends on how many namespaces you need in a supervisor cluster. And this obviously saves some resources in terms of required edge nodes in your edge cluster.
Is there a limit right now for the number of namespaces that are available per supervisor cluster?
Most likely, yes. I don't know the limit on the supervisor cluster level.
Okay, so for this particular example, so this would be more of an HA, like an HA pair of the supervisor cluster for the workload domains?
Yeah, so each tier 1, has a active standby piece, right, in your edge nodes. So NSX-T will spread those instances across your edge cluster, which means for each tier 1 you have 2 instances in your edge cluster, and therefore we have up to 200 tier 1s we can support for a given supervisor cluster. So in this design, if you want, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Raymond.
Okay, so this is more about consolidating edge nodes, sharing an edge cluster, NSX-T, sharing the connectivity in the fabric, but serving multiple supervisor clusters. Obviously, you need to be aware of scalability limits within that given edge cluster. So if you have specific bandwidth requirements or you see traffic increasing in your supervisor cluster, you may want to separate the pure routing and forwarding traffic from network services like load balancing, network address translation, and such. So what I mean by that is that you can place your tier 0 as a centralized, consolidated north-south egress-ingress point to your physical network, purely having your edge cluster for forwarding packets, right, on your tier 0, and then have an additional edge cluster where you're consolidating resources for load balancing and netting, and that most likely is a bit more CPU CPU consuming kind of resource. So here you have a clear separation from services versus routing, forwarding packets. Still considering the limits for a given edge cluster.
And I'm assuming the next slide is, well, no, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I was thinking that we could go to a load balanced or redundant pair for those load balancing services that are out at that edge cluster that you had just described for routing. Perhaps?
You mean multiple edge clusters for routing?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll come to that, but there are some current limitations I will share as well.
Okay.
So a next model would be obviously this would be your first multi-tenant container as a service kind of approach, where each given supervisor cluster gets a dedicated edge cluster for networking services. So this will scale better, right? You can have more edge clusters per supervisor cluster, which means you have more namespaces available for a given supervisor cluster. Still separating load balancing, networking, network administration services from forwarding packets on the tier 0. And then you can, in this case, I'm assuming it's fine to have multiple supervisor clusters to share the same tier 0. So we have a centralized, consolidated north-south path for this kind of workloads. That means that this edge cluster can run on a single cluster, and therefore you only need to connect the VLANs you need for north-south traffic to that cluster. If you want a pure multi-tenant kind of design and have restrictive requirements in terms of connectivity, you can move on to a topology like this, where you have a dedicated edge cluster for each supervisor cluster. So this can be tenant A, tenant B with their own supervisor cluster, or let's say test production. And they have dedicated tier 0, which means you can configure dedicated north-south traffic configuration and connectivity towards your physical network, and also for production, for example. In this picture, I only drew one physical router, but obviously that can be different physical routers to connect to, right? Maybe your production supervisor cluster is on a different rack or different infrastructure connecting to different top of racks. So you can really make different connectivity. You have different connectivity options there. What it does mean is that in this case, you are sharing your edge nodes for resources for your tier 0 and your tier 1s. And what's not yet possible right now, with using a single transport zone, that is to have that separation like you have here, separation of tier 0 and tier 1, and have multi-tenancy. That's currently being developed. So that's upcoming for future releases. So if you want a pure multi-tenant design, this is the current supported solution right now. If you really want to have similar separation as this topology, then I recommend to create different transport zones. But that has caveats of its own. So it really depends on how long you need to wait for that to be available in the product. The reasoning behind that is that the logic to automatically detach to a tier 0 when you create tier 1s for your namespaces and your supervisor cluster is that it finds it either in the edge cluster as an instance, or it finds it in the transport zone as a distributed router component. And that's the technology behind it, if you like. So I hope that makes sense. So that are currently the 5 design options we see the most and we currently can support.
So if we go back to the most, let's call it basic design for the POC, for when we're in, let's call it intra-edge tier, within the edge cluster itself.
Yeah.
And we need to speak within intra-application services. So we would want to, let's look at things like maybe microseg between those given instances. How is that handled? So we're seeing here in your diagram and whatnot, we're seeing a lot of north-south traffic. So how is east-west traffic handled within the edge services itself?
So you mean from a namespace to another namespace?
Sure, another namespace to another namespace, or even intra-application within that edge cluster stack.
So I'm not sure what you mean by intra-application in that edge cluster stack. So So everything connecting in and out a namespace. Let's say you have pods running in this namespace. You are using a load balancer, the load balancer instance created by NSX-T. The only way to reach that workloads is through the tier 1 and the load balancer IP, ingress IP you configure, assuming you hide the internal IP addresses of the pods, right? So if we need to have traffic between namespaces, I would say, obviously the distributed firewall for that namespace is on each pod NIC, right? So we can secure pod-to-pod traffic, and each namespace is isolated by that sense. So you need to allow that from your application specs, right? Your YAMLs, the things you need to do to configure. And then you have to expose the port you want to be reachable on the namespace. So let's say you want to expose port 80 with service type load balancer. That will instantiate an ingress IP on the load balancer on the tier 1 to be available to be accessed externally, but also from different tiers, if you like, if you need that, right? So therefore you need to open, expose the ports, and from a tier 1, from the dark blue namespace, traffic could traverse through the tier 1, and then in the edge nodes, since it's a stateful service on the tier 1, it will reach the edge nodes. It will be forwarded to the tier 0 in the edge nodes, and then forwarded back into the tier 1 SR, so the services router, and then it can be sent inbound to the distributed router and the workloads on the host. Does that make sense?
It does. So for these particular applications, so what have you seen as far as real world use cases, even for just to build out the simple POC as we see with just a single supervisor and single edge cluster? What's the business drivers behind this, or where do you see a customer particularly leaping into this?
So I don't have recent customer experience with this kind of topologies. What I do see with NSX-T, with container workloads in that sense, is that the challenges come where to expose what, right? Most of the time, if they are developing applications, you want to expose the service you're developing in the application to a public space or an application group or users in a corporation. So I work with, for example, a big European service provider which developed apps for their store. And the containers need to be exposed through load balancing instances, through physical gateways, routers to the physical network. But in the meantime, we also saw that the internal developers came from a different network source. So what we were struggling with is that to be able to maintain that, we need to expose different routes, if you like, to the network, to different sources and destination, right? Only exposing, let's say, the load balancing IP to the people working or the people accessing the app. But in the meantime, you also need to expose different things, maybe for certain developers to be able to reach the environment. That's the most challenging, I think.
I'm gonna take it back up a level because I try to struggle listening to this stuff without looking at the slides and some of the guys that are on listening to the podcast. A lot of us guys are in our cars listening to the podcast and won't get to see this. But from the simple case down to these 5 options, from a hardware perspective, like how does this scale? What do I need to put in place? How am I speccing out this environment? I know you've talked, the edge cluster and then, the architecture, the tiers. But from a high level, what does it look like from a hardware perspective? And then from a scalability, how many worker nodes am I going to be able to get in these type of environments?
So I think at least you need to have some management resources available to be able to run NSX management plane, right? So the NSX-T managers, so 3 VMs. And then for supervisor cluster kind of workloads, it's most likely that the edge nodes themselves will run on top of that supervisor cluster because that's where the services are being consumed, right? So you want to have load balancing and net as close as possible to the workloads. So you need at least vSphere kind of number of hosts to accommodate things like vSphere HA to have enough space for a given edge node. So a large edge VM takes quite a lot of resources. You can start with 2 of them for high availability, of course, and both can forward traffic with an active tier 0. And then basically you can have up to 40 namespaces to start with, right?
Right.
If you need to scale out, you want to add hosts, and you can add Edge Node VMs to that cluster to be able to accommodate for more namespaces.
Okay. So I guess I get that. Worker nodes. If I'm building a worker node, I guess it depends on what application I'm running on each worker node, how much, what I want to allocate from a resource perspective. And I guess each one of those can just be an individual VM running on a host, et cetera, right? I'm speccing out my worker nodes to be just whatever the application needs for each worker node, I would assume.
So you mean the vSphere worker nodes in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about so I don't know the limits of a vSphere cluster with Tanzu. So I'm more an NSX architect, I'm not aware of the vSphere limits. But certainly some limits will apply, but each vSphere host will be a worker node. So if you need more worker nodes, depending on how many pods you need.
Okay. The other question I always have when I'm, architecting this is like, how much network traffic can I expect to have through this kind of these tiers?
Yes, so that depends on a number of factors. First of all, the physical NIC speed of the host you're running on top of, the amount of NICs you have. We most commonly see 2 PNIC or 4 PNIC kind of clusters, and obviously in 2 PNIC clusters, you are sharing the PNICs with management, vMotion, obviously Geneva overlay networking, and north-south. So in this, for example, if you take the simplest design option, this is the most consolidated design available, right? You're sharing north-south traffic with Geneva overlay traffic for NSX-T, and also sharing management and vMotion traffic, and perhaps even vSAN if you use that too. So the amount of throughput depends on the speed of the physical NIC, and if you do an active design on tier 0, we can scale out to up to 8 active instances for that tier 0 running on different hosts. So you have more throughput throughout your cluster. So each host can forward traffic north-south from a tier 0 perspective. So if you have, say, 10 gig cards, you can have up to 80 gigs of throughput, theoretically.
Okay. So good. Thank you for that. That makes sense. Question for you. When you're deploying this, or if you've done maybe some POCs with some customers, right? What are the biggest mistakes that customers tend to make, and what should they be watching out for?
Most common thing is that obviously there's quite a lot of routing going on, right? So when you want to start with Tanzu, you're really thrilled to get cloud native apps running. You want to start with containers, and most likely you have application teams waiting for you to deliver that. And what I see the most is that NSX-T obviously can be fairly is a product by itself, right? The technology by itself. And it starts with configuring overlay networking and stuff. And what I see the most is network misconfiguration, right? Edge nodes not being able to connect with Geneva through hosts, or inabilities to operate the platform because a lack of training or enablement. So we really want to make sure we bridge the gap between, let's say, the general vSphere stuff and obviously Tanzu, which is a complex by itself running cloud native apps kind of workloads. But if you use NSX-T, you really want to be ready and prepared and consider how you want to use it, what's important for you, and what you need to take care of on the physical network before you get started.
But so this isn't the place to start learning NSX-T, right? Like
well, it's fair. The guides are really good. so it's very prescriptive in the documentation what you need to create, right? It's in terms of NSX-T not the most complex topology, but still you have to have those requirements, right? And understand what you need to have traffic between edge nodes and hosts and stuff running, and that's sometimes being forgotten.
Ray, are you aware of, let's say that you're an operator now that's just used to traditional workloads, and now you've gone through something like Kube Academy or just started to deploy your first containers, and maybe you've done so successfully or gone through Kube.Academy, and now you want to do that next component, right? Now you want to start to layer in that NSX-T. Is there training resources out there that you're aware of, or anything that you've gone through personally through your own learning journey of how these integrate that are out there that you could share with our listeners?
So what I like very much about vSphere with Tanzu is that everything you deploy, like pods, namespaces, service type, load balancer, ingress, you see it in vSphere, but you also see it in NSX-T being materialized, right? I'm not aware of this specific integration-based training. I was planning to do some series about how to operate NSX-T with Tanzu and show it how it works. Let's say if you deploy a load balancer, what you can expect in NSX-T. You definitely can look for troubleshooting and operation kind of training to really know how to operate the product. Obviously install, configure, manage for NSX-T. But the good thing is, I think, if you look in the UI of NSX-T, you see the inventory page. If you look there, you can also see everything related to containers and namespaces. You can see what's attached to a given namespace. And you can see things like, interfaces, segments, distributed firewalls. So that would be the first place to look for if I were you.
Okay. I have a super high level question, which, we have Velo Cloud on and they talk about edge networking, right? And the edge word tends to be hyper loaded here, maybe. What does edge mean when we talk about an edge cluster? It isn't like an external edge kind of what Velo Cloud talks about edge, where you're putting a network out in a bank, right? Versus edge in this case.
Okay, so an edge node in NSX-T is just a networking appliance, dedicated resources for any logical networking constructs you want to deploy on. So think about load balancing, firewalling, network address translation, and such. So it's just similar to a vSphere host, but then in networking, hosting networking stuff instead.
Got it. So it's really just a container for a set of services, and we just call that the edge cluster, right? Okay.
Yeah. So a bunch of those nodes, the VM appliances, they show as VM appliances, form an edge cluster, and the cluster by itself is obviously there to consider HA, right? So they exchange heartbeats with each other. So if you have instances running on a particular edge node, and for some reason the host goes down where that edge node is running, the other edge nodes can take over those running services.
So as long as we got master architects, VCDX here, hairpinning, does hairpinning come into this? Do I have to worry about routes that are coming from one place to another and whether I'm trapping, doing extra traffic that I don't need to be?
So any pod-to-pod traffic is distributed traffic. There's no hairpinning there. If you look at services, things like load balancing, ingress, network address translation, that's a services router component, which is only run on an edge node. So if you need cross namespace connectivity, it will run through the edge nodes. So there could potentially be some hairpinning going on if that edge node is running on a different host or a different cluster. So in the example I showed earlier, where you have multiple edge node clusters, a single edge node cluster with multiple supervisor clusters, one of those could potentially hairpin through Fabric to the edge cluster and then come back to another namespace hosted on the same cluster, if that makes sense.
Okay, good. Matt, I got another question. If you want to let me keep going, I'll just keep asking these
By
high
all
level
means,
questions.
I love where we're going with this.
All right, in the news today, Andy, what's his name? Andy Jasso, right? Was announced yesterday that he's going to take over Amazon. Jeff Bezos is going to resign. He's going to be pumped up to on the board, and then he's going to take over. So AWS Cloud is always in our minds here. And Andy used to work at VMware, so that's kind of an interesting scenario playing out. When we talk about AWS and cloud, right? Like does NSX-T? I assume it's available in Cloud Foundation. I can run this across from Amazon to my data center. That's how we're selling, network fabric setup. Does any of this apply? I assume I could probably set this up at AWS on VMC on AWS if I get Cloud Foundation payload. Are you seeing anybody connect things through cloud or do any of this on cloud services, or are we just way too early for any of that kind of work? So it's really, is there a cloud play in this conversation? That's super high level question. Like, have you seen anybody doing this at AWS or in the cloud?
Myself, no, not yet, no. Okay. But I've heard it's a really common thing, to have that question,
Because I was just wondering, like, okay, so we have our architecture here, right, which is how NSX-T. This is how we want to build a Kubernetes network. Just wondering how that differentiates between what we're doing and what people are getting exposed to on AWS. And maybe that's another topic. We'll bring somebody in to talk about, like how networking configuration is happening in AWS versus how we're doing it in the data center. And this is in the data center, and that's fine. Just was curious whether there was any story there, but doesn't sound like there is yet. Too early. All right. The other things that we do, I know we've been going for maybe 35, 40 minutes here. We have the FutureNet. I should do a shout out to FutureNet, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen this year from a training perspective, where to learn things. So FutureNet is going to be, let me get my notes up here.
March 23rd, I believe. March 23rd.
Yep, March 23rd. I believe you. My notes are somewhere deep behind a screen. Oh, there they are. Yeah, March 23rd. Good. You can go to future-net.com and go register for that event. So I will say, if you want to learn about networking and learn about the future of networking, VMware helps sponsor this, but I think we only have 2 speakers at FutureNet this year. The other speakers, it's going to be an all-day kind of online conference. There are speakers from all different companies talking about the future of networking technology. And I think we have 2 people going to be talking at FutureNet, VMware, but all the other speakers are, industry speakers. So do a shout out there. You can also go to vmware.com/FutureNet, all one word, and we have a page that talks about what's going to be happening there. March 23rd. Go register. It's all day. Should be a great learning experience. And then speaking about learning experience, Ray. Where do we point people that want to get started? Is there, I know you talked a little bit about some of the documentation that's out there. Maybe we could just do pointers to documentation. And then are there good places to go pay attention to these topics, websites or other places? Where do people get trained to start, and I guess you can always go to community VMTN and ask questions. If you get stuck, there are people there. What can we talk about with regard to what's the best way to, engage with people and do some learning here?
So I would definitely start with the vSphere documentation site, which from start to finish explains what you need to set up for NSX-T and in vSphere with Tanzu to get your first workload management or your first supervised cluster going. I'm not a Kubernetes expert, but on Kubernetes I did a bit of Linux Academy classes, so I understand that. And obviously work with NSX-T if you're very, very networking focus or need to have those requirements on the physical network. Make sure you understand NSX-T and get some training there.
Yeah, so we should just say that our last podcast, which was I think 540, talks about Cube Academy Pro. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, you can go listen there, and they talk about what's available, and you can go sign up for that stuff. It's free. They have advanced classes. I think they have like 5 advanced classes. You can go learn about Kubernetes and how to build this out. And we thought we would have some networking in to talk about how to set up the network as well. And then I don't think we're having a network day anytime. I don't know if we have a networking day where you can go. I know they are doing cloud, and they have the networking, the external networking conference, but I'm not sure where else there is engagement around NSX-T. But yeah, Matt, any things that strike you as things that we should ask Ray while he's here?
A couple of things. One, Ray, what's next for your blog? What's the new article that you're working on? What can we expect to see here in the coming weeks or months or quarters out on cloudextreme.info?
So for sure, I'm going to update or place a new article with the latest possibilities with vSphere with Tanzu, where we explain the separation of tier 1 per namespace. So I will update a post based on that. So for people running the most latest and greatest releases, they are up to speed there. I recently released an article about Inter TEP traffic, so for collapsed edge clusters. And like I said earlier, I might do a bunch of blog posts about how NSX-T operates with Tanzu, right? So what I said earlier, if you create a namespace, what can you expect in NSX-T and how can you manage and operate that? What happens if you do a load balancer or the ingress controller with using vSphere on Tanzu? You will see stuff happening in NSX-T, server pools, load balancing instances, ingress IP being allocated from the IP pools and stuff. So I think that could be a good one to expand on and do a series on, perhaps with YouTube demos to show what's going on.
So what does it look like from the NSX management plane after you've made the individual calls? Sure. Sounds like a great series.
Cool, thanks.
So we do ask, there is the community element to this, and I think that we would be remiss if we didn't touch on your VCDX experience just a little bit. So if I may ask, how long did it take, and can you expand a little bit on the process? What made you feel that was a path that you needed to go down for your career? And just a little bit overall of your experience from that certification and now that you've achieved it, sir.
So I considered it already in when I was in PSO. But as you may know, when you're in PSO, you have a hectic life, traveling a lot. I also have family and kids, and I really couldn't commit to that commitment back then. You need to spend a lot of hours writing, designing, and all that stuff you need to deliver before you can submit your VCDX. But then in the customer success team, I got a great opportunity with a customer to work on an NSX-T design. I did actually the first VCDX on NSX-T. So that was something I'm really proud of. And with that customer, which was obviously pretty early on NSX-T, I got the opportunity to do workshops with them, work on the design, be able to work on all the required documentations you need to deliver. And that really got me going. And for me, it took a little bit more than 6 months because I was in the flow, right? I was anyway having to do it, and got great support from my team and the customer. So I was able to do it in 6 months, and it was quite hard work, a lot of hours spent. Obviously, the defense day is interesting by itself. Very happy I passed it in one go, but it was an amazing experience. I would say I couldn't succeed this without my experience in PSO, I would say, because in PSO days, I did a lot of met with a lot of interesting customers with different use cases, learned how to understand different requirements, constraints, understand that whole piece. And that makes you think on your feet, if you like, right? So you really need that hands-on experience in terms of being an architect in front of the customer to be able to successfully defend actually your design. So yeah, pretty good experience from my side. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself moving to maybe perhaps another one? Or there's so many now that have that's the next level up, right? Where we have
Yeah.
multiple VCDX across VUs. Do you see yourself doing that?
Definitely, at some point, if I have a nice opportunity. I don't want to do it on a fictive design, right? Fictional design. So if I would, for example, if I would be on a nice, sizable engagement with a customer doing vSphere with Tanzu, for example, that could be a nice one to submit a defense on for, the data center virtualization track, for example. So I keep it in my mind. I'm in no rush. I think the second is always a bit easier than your first. But yeah, I keep it in my mind. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions I have on your blog, you also have Design Expert 6 Network Virtualization Certification. And I just want to shout out that you don't have to become a VCDX. You can just go get certifications at the same time, which is, a nicer way to just, learn everything without having to do a whole VCDX app, right? There are lighter ways to do this. And it looks like you've done it, right? So yeah.
It's been a while ago. It was also tough, but yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, we are coming up to the top of the hour, and I know we got a few minute late start. But Raymond, thanks for doing the blog. Your blog is beautiful, by the way. So everybody that's listening, cloudextreme.info, XTREME. I would say that this is one of the nicer ways you've put together your articles, right? Very clean. Your graphics are nice. You do a very, very nice job just taking you through your blog articles. So well done there. Like one of the more professional, nice looking blogs, and easy to consume. You got videos there with screenshots. So definitely one. And you've been at this, looks like from 2015, you have the nice archives links there. So you can see all the articles that you've produced. So if you want to kill a couple hours, go check out cloudextreme.info and spend time here. This is actually a really, really beautiful blog. Any other goals that you have for 2021? I know with COVID, there's always challenges here, but what are your big goals that you want to accomplish? We'll go out on this one, and Matt will let you ask him a final question. My question is, Ray, what are you trying to accomplish in 2021?
So I need to focus more on multi-cloud kind of solutions. We see more and more customers asking us about that. I'm relatively new. I did some AWS trading in the past, but I really need to revisit that to really be ready, discussing that technology with the customer. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm planning to, I come from a vSphere NSX-T background, but I really want to more understand the cloud native, or let's say the application side of the story, right? And then, I'm able to do the basic Kubernetes stuff, right? I can deploy an ingress controller or a service type load balancer. I want to understand it a bit deeper. So I might do the Google Kubernetes, the CKA certification for fun. And I really like Terraform as well. So I have some blog posts about Terraform. I found Terraform amazing, how easy it is to get stuff done in vSphere and NSX-T. And I know multi-cloud also supports Terraform, so I'm looking forward to dive into that as well.
Matt, a great answer, like that, and I also feel like, oh my God, you're not a god. You have things you want to try to learn next year, which is awesome.
Keep learning. It's going
exactly.
on. Keep learning.
Matt, any last comments?
Yeah, sure. Ray, for our listeners out there, if you wouldn't mind, what is your Twitter handle, sir? If they would like to follow you along and get updates on those blog posts as they're coming along, and your comments on the Twitter sphere in general.
It's at De Jong Raymond.
Can you spell that out for us?
So at Delta Echo Juliet Oscar November Golf Romeo Alpha Yankee Mike Oscar November Delta.
Fantastic. A great point for all things NSX.
All right. Well, that's beautiful. All right. Well, we'll transition the last 2 minutes of the show. We'll do V Barbecue. I don't see Tony Foster on TalkShoe today, so I will just go it alone. It is Super Bowl weekend here in the United States, right? We're coming up that, so we are going to be doing hot wings. So you can go buy online the hot wing sauce for good hot wings, right? And get the nice orange sauce. You can go buy that stuff bottled up, ready to go. Then all you do is put your chicken wings on the grill, grill them up, get them charcoaly, and then just put them in a bowl, put the sauce on, and mix it all up, and you are good for high quality chicken wings, Matt.
You did it wrong, Eric. You did it wrong. You have to bake the wings on the grill, then dip them in sauce. Then you throw the wings that have been sauced back on the grill to get that little bit of now char and caramelization to the sauce.
No, I don't want that.
Then
no,
you
I want
consume.
them. I like the
There's
wet,
your
drippy.
construct. Right there's your YAML file for wing build. So
I want mine wet and drippy, and then some blue cheese and celery always goes well. Matt, who you going for? Are you going for Tampa or are you going for Kansas City?
yes.
Yes, exactly. Anybody that wins is good enough for me. So we always be a winner. Just say you were for the winner of the winner. For sure. Ray, thanks a lot for being on the show. Matt, thanks as well. Shout out to Julia Klaus. Julia, thanks for doing the recordings and keeping us going every week. We know we've reached out to invite several other people. I think we're going to have Mike Hume on. They're going to be doing a cloud and native apps launch coming up. And so we're going to bring Mike on to talk about what's happening in 2021 with cloud and native apps. So look forward to that next week. And we'll continue on. We're trying to get every week this week done, do a podcast every week. And thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.